Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 16 for History 102. And we had left off in May of 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania. And a lot of Americans were ready to go to war with Germany. But one American in particular that wasn't ready was President Wilson. So Wilson is going to negotiate with the Axis powers and keep us out of war, which will lead us to the next big event, is the election in 1916. The thing that Wilson has been working towards his entire first term, trying to build up enough support to win re-election against all odds, because remember, he only received 42% of the vote in 1912. Well, this election is going to boil down to a two-person election. Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election, and the Republicans will nominate Supreme Court Justice Charles Hughes as their candidate, who's a brilliant attorney and a New Yorker. Now, in this election, Wilson will run a campaign, and his slogan, will be, quote, "He kept us out of war," which he did. World War I started in 1914, and even though the Germans especially were getting more and more aggressive, he had stalled off the country and kept us out of that war. Now, candidate Hughes is a pretty popular candidate, but his one flaw is he won't take a stand on World War I. Reporters really can't corner him into saying, if elected, will he enter the war on the side of the Allies or not? So it's going to get down to just a couple weeks before the war, before the election. Elections are a lot like wars. And there's going to be a famous interview with former President Theodore Roosevelt, who by this point can't stand Woodrow Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt thought there was no bones about it. When the Lusitania was sunk, we should have entered that war. And he sort of looks at Wilson as a coward and whatnot. Plus, he doesn't like some of his policies, plus he lost in the previous election to him. So he's interviewed, and he's pressed to endorse candidate Hughes, the Republican. But Theodore Roosevelt refuses to endorse him because Hughes will not take a stand on the war. So in this interview, Theodore Roosevelt basically says, as far as he's concerned, there's no difference between Wilson and Hughes. Both of them are cowards. And he goes on to say, in fact, Hughes is nothing but, quote, a whiskered Wilson. Because Hughes had a big beard, was his trademark. So, Roosevelt won't endorse anybody. A lot of people paid attention to what Theodore Roosevelt said. So, election night happens, and this is an extremely close election. And in fact, everybody goes to bed that night not knowing who won. Now, the map that shows you the electoral results is on page 685. Now, the big difference in the election and why nobody knew who won was the state of California. And back then, it's 13 electoral college votes. When they tallied up the votes in the state of California finally the next day, Woodrow Wilson won California by 3,800 votes, thus getting all 13 of the Electoral College votes, and that was the difference in the election. You can see he had 277 Electoral College votes to Hughes' 254. So the difference was California. So you got to hand it to Woodrow Wilson and his top advisor, Louis Brandeis. They put together a perfect campaign from day one on Inauguration Day to Election Day 1916 to get Woodrow Wilson reelected against all odds. So now what we want to turn our attention to is how we're going to end up entering the war. Now, a lot of people really wanted to enter this war long before we did in 1917, besides Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Woodrow Wilson's going to find himself in a place where the Germans especially just keep pushing and pushing till finally he has no choice. To give you an idea of how people were so gung-ho for this war, dating back in the summer of 1915, due to popular demand by citizens, the War Department started having summer training camps for young men where instead of going on a summer vacation, they could go to a military installation and have a crash course 2-week boot camp to prepare them in case war did break out. And these were highly popular. One of the places where these War Department summer training camps took place was right here in Plattsburgh at the old Army base on the old Oval in Plattsburgh. And a lot of men trained there over the next couple summers in these 2-week crash courses. This ultimately led to the creation of the ROTC, which is seen to have its origins right here in Plattsburgh in these training camps. Now, one big event that's going to take place that's really going to change the German attitude is there's going to be a revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviks will take over, and one of the first things they're going to do is withdraw from the war. So the Allies lose a major player, the Russians, on their side. Remember, don't be confused. The Russians were our allies in both World War I and II. Now, with that said, that means all attention can go away from the Eastern Front and go to the Western Front in the battlefields of France and Belgium. So the Russians really the Germans pick up the heat here, and that's when a famous telegram is going to be intercepted by British intelligence that's really going to change the way a lot of Americans look at what's going on in this war that basically is over on the European continent and that a lot of Americans believe we have no part in entering into. This famous telegram, which was intercepted by British intelligence and given to the United States in late February of 1917, is the Zimmermann telegram. It was a telegram sent from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico City, the ambassador to Mexico. And in this telegram, he instructs the German ambassador to enter into negotiations to form a German-Mexican military alliance. And that ultimately what they want is Mexico to declare war on the United States. Now remember, this isn't too far-fetched. The United States is running roughshod in the Mexican countryside trying to hunt down Pancho Villa, as we talked about before. And what the German game plan is, if Mexico goes to war with the United States, that'll keep us occupied, which will allow Germany the chance to finish off England and France, win World War I on the European continent, then they'll come and join the Mexicans and help Mexico defeat the United States and take back the southwestern United States from Mexico, which we won from them in the Mexican-American War of the 1840s. Now, I know that's a complicated scheme, but at the time, it all sounds credible. So on March 1st, the United States government will release the contents of the famous Zimmermann telegram to the press, and they'll print it on the front page of all U.S. newspapers. Now, then in the month of March, tensions heighten as American cargo ships headed to Europe are being routinely sunk by German U-boats. And in fact, the United States starts arming cargo ships with anti-submarine weapons, so we're almost fighting when it comes to March of 1917. On April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson calls another special session of Congress, one of his favorite things to do, and he makes his famous declaration of war speech. In that speech, he unveils a couple of the buzz phrases from World War I, that this will be a war to end all wars, and it'll be a war to make the world safe for democracy. Now, that speech is delivered on April 2nd. It's going to create 4 days of heated debate in the House and the Senate because the nation is divided on whether or not we should enter this war. There are just as many people who think it's a bad idea, that it's going against what George Washington had told us in his famous farewell address to stay out of European land wars. And also we had a lot of ties to Germany, and the Irish wanted no part of this thing. They'd rather fight England. But after 4 days of heated debate and numerous members of the House and a handful in the Senate voting against the declaration of war, it will pass both houses. So on April 6th, we'll declare war on the Axis powers. Now, or the Central Powers, excuse me, I misspoke. So, once again, though, sort of like the Spanish-American War, we're going to declare war and prepare after. We really don't have a military prepared to go to war with, especially the Germans who are highly advanced. And the war, remember, has been going on in Europe since 1914. So, when we declare war, the United States military has just 200,000 men in it. Obviously, we're going to need to add a lot to that, and as we'll find out, by the time we're ready for combat, we'll bring that up to 3 million men. Those 200,000 men at the time of April 6, 1917, are equipped with 300,000 outdated rifles dating back to the Spanish-American War. Weapon technology has changed dramatically since then. So we got our work cut out for us. We have to equip 3 million men with state-of-the-art weapons. The state-of-the-art weapon of the time in the trenches of France and Belgium are machine guns. The United States Army in April of 1917 only has 1,500 machine guns total. So we got our work cut out for us. Munitions manufacturers have to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to meet these needs. Another prime weapon of World War I that has evolved during the war is airplanes. Airplanes are fighting over the skies of Europe, and you've probably read about the famous Red Baron, the German pilot, before. The United States at this point in history in the Army Air Corps, because remember there's no such thing as the Air Force until after World War II, has a grand total of 55 out-of-date planes that if we sent them to the skies of Europe would be shot out of the sky in an afternoon. So we have to completely put together an Air Force. Now, another major technological breakthrough of the time is the use of field radios to communicate in the trenches and battlefields of Europe. The United States in April 1917 has a grand total of 2 field radios in the entire military. I suppose that's better than one, because who would you talk to if you only had one radio? So as you can see, we got our work cut out for us, and we got to act fast. So the very next month, Congress will pass the Selective Service Act, and we'll have a draft, and we'll end up drafting 2.8 million men into the military to bring our force up to 3 million. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a very unpopular war among many Americans. And World War I, in reality, is the draft dodgers war. When we think of draft dodgers, most people routinely think of Vietnam. It's estimated that nearly 330,000 men dodged the draft during World War I. A much larger number than dodged the draft during Vietnam. But the reason why so many men successfully dodged the draft was that it was really easy to dodge the draft during World War I. Basically, to dodge the draft, all you had to do is move to a different city and change your name. Because you got to realize, there's no such thing as photo ID. There's no such thing as a driver's license. The first driver's licenses aren't issued until the 1920s. And there's no such thing as a social security number. That doesn't come about until 1935. So you can easily change your identity and no one can track you. You go to a different city, nobody's going to know who you are. And remember, we're not in this war for long. It's going to end by November of 1918. So by the time they even start tracking down any draft dodgers, it's too late. The war is over with. So this is the draft dodgers war. There's no doubt about it. Not Vietnam. And during Vietnam, if you wanted to dodge the draft, you had a couple choices. Move to Canada or go underground. You couldn't work anywhere because the minute that any money was paid into your Social Security account, they would track you down the next day. So, the war, the United States enters the war, and Woodrow Wilson knows one of his main duties is to sell the war to the American public because it's so unpopular. So he's going to create the Committee on Public Information. And the whole purpose of this committee is to sell the war and the war effort to the American public. He's going to put a person who has a journalistic background in charge of it, a man by the name of George Creel, C-R-E-E-L. And it's his job to make the war popular in America. Now, his government agency, the Committee on Public Information, is going to publish more than 75 million pamphlets. They're going to routinely censor newspapers who are trying to print negative stories about the war. And they're going to have at their disposal 150,000 employees working for the Committee on Public Information. 75,000 of them are part-time workers known as the 4 Minutemen, playing off the Minutemen of the Revolutionary War. And what their job was to go and deliver 4-minute speeches to civic organizations across the country to sell the war to civic groups like the Rotary Club and the Lions Club and groups like that. And what they would do was very effective. They would call up like the Noon Rotary and say, I'd like to be put on your agenda for your next meeting. And the person in charge might say, well, I'm sorry, we got a full agenda. We don't have time for you this week. And they'd say, certainly you must have 4 minutes for the war in your country. And they'd guarantee these groups that they would only speak for 4 minutes and not a second longer. And they held to that. So they'd get their spiel across to civic leaders, And then maybe a month later, they'd call again to ask to be on the agenda. And how could you turn them down? Because you knew they'd only take 4 minutes. And it's sort of the patriotic thing to do. Very effective group. Unfortunately, they were too effective. And they're going to create an anti-German mood in America. Even though this is a war against the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire also, it's Germany that's our main focus. And because of this selling of the war, German Americans are going to be the victims of prejudice. And remember, there are nearly 8 million people with ties to Germany in the United States out of a population of 100 million. There's going to be rumors of German spies everywhere. And unfortunately, some people with German last names will be beaten, tarred and feathered, even lynched during this period. And we go to extraordinarily stupid extents to squash this German influence in our society. Orchestras in many states were banned from playing any German music, like Mozart and so forth. And schools all stopped teaching the German language. If you were a German teacher in high school or college, you're unemployed. All the programs were dismantled. Bars quit serving pretzels, and all beers that had German names had to change the names of those beers, or they would have went out of business. In restaurants, most restaurants renamed sauerkraut as Liberty cabbage on their menus. And hamburgers, which were mistakenly, people believed were developed in Hamburg, Germany, but obviously they weren't, if you know anything about the origin of the name, were renamed Liberty Steaks. We're going to go to all these ridiculous, measures to sort of wipe Germany out of American culture. Sort of like after when we invade Iraq and France didn't agree with us, and we renamed French fries Freedom Fries, as many of you may remember, and people were routinely pouring out French wine into the gutters of American cities. All other pretty ridiculous notions, if you think about it. So, the next thing that's going to happen here in this whole trying to sell the Americans on the war is Congress is going to take action and pass a couple of pieces of legislation to enforce patriotism. They're going to pass the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918. We're going to kind of lump these together and treat them as one. And basically, what it prohibited was any aiding of the enemy, obstructing of the recruitment of soldiers, encouraging disloyalty, and speaking disloyally or profanely about the United States government, the flag, or the armed forces. Now, under these laws, 2,000 people will be arrested for violating them, and it'll range all over the place from really ridiculous enforcement of this law to the most high-profile enforcement of this law, when the famous perennial socialist candidate Eugene Debs is arrested and convicted for violating the Sedition Act in 1918. He was an open opponent of the U.S. involvement in World War I. And a lot of people who were against the war saw this as a war to support the merchants of death. Because remember, we're selling the Europeans arms long before we entered the war, and that's one of the causes of the sinking of the Lusitania. So, Eugene Debs was speaking against it, but I mean, he's a politician. He's supposed to have freedom of speech rights. But because of these two laws, the Supreme Court will make famous decisions including the one of Eugene Debs' appeal of his conviction, and they will determine that Eugene Debs and others convicted of violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts were what amounted to, quote, clear and present dangers to the United States government that Congress had every right to prohibit. So they upheld the constitutionality of these laws, and because of that, Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for making speeches. There's a famous photo of Eugene Debs, if you wonder what he looks like, on page 689 in your book. There's a face for the name. Now, to jump forward a little bit about what happens to Eugene Debs, in 1920, Eugene Debs, while sitting in a federal prison cell, will run for the presidency of the United States once again. He runs every election. In that election, the winner will be President Harding, as we'll find out later. Eugene Debs in that election in 1920 will receive nearly 1 million votes from a prison cell. Because of that impressive showing, shortly after being sworn in, President Harding in 1921 will pardon Eugene Debs and have him released from prison. Because in his mind, there were a million reasons why to do that, namely the people that voted for him. So, that's the end of this particular lecture. We'll pick back up with many other government agencies that were created during World War I for the war effort. So I'm going to take a little break here, class. I'll be back momentarily, and we'll continue on with World War I. See you soon.